And if you look at what we did at our last meeting, we addressed some issues that had to do with keeping our children safe, the health of our children, watching some bills on teacher evaluation, supporting some bills on school finance. But the big discussion that we had was the same discussion that you heard here, and that is local control funding and adequate funding for our schools. And just to be clear, changing the formula on how you distribute a limited amount of money to our schools does not give our schools more money. And so we have to think that we have to continue to advocate for adequate funding, and we support organizationally the goals of more funding for more needy children. We support the goals of having a less complex, simpler system, simpler funding. We think that those are good goals. Those are things that we need to be working for. But as you heard even John was talking about, is every time and Joan Buchanan was talking about, as you look through this and people look at this more carefully, there are more questions and more issues that come up, and there's a big difference between a goal and an implementation and making sure that it is absolutely correct and absolutely right. And so when we have been looking at it, there are a couple of issues that we think are important and that we will be hoping that the legislature addresses. First and foremost, we believed that this was something that was so important that it had to go through the policy committees, because it does make significant changes to policies about education in California. And the other thing that we looked at and we said is that we need to make sure that the base amount, the amount of money that every child gets and every school gets is adequate, is sufficient. You can't have something that has a base amount so low that it doesn't meet the needs of the children. And one of the things that as PTA we have continually talked about and want to have some mechanism, some way of ensuring that whatever we do, we have a complete quality education for every child. Do we do it through a categorical? Do we do it through a template? Do we do it through a plan? Do we do it through accountability? We need to have some sort of mechanism is that when that money comes down, we ensure that our children have some things I think that a lot of us would agree on. Teachers who have the professional development they need. Administrators who have the professional development they need. The restoration of the furlough days so that kids get a full year of education. We need to make sure, for example, that we have class sizes that meet the needs of our children. And we need to make sure that all children have access to a curriculum that includes not only math and English, but a curriculum that includes art, music, librarians, counselors. The list can go, school nurses. We want to make sure that our kids get those kinds of services. And we want to make sure that when we provide extra money, and the extra money is supposed to help children who may be English language learners, or maybe children in foster care, or maybe children with special needs, or maybe children of low income, we want to make sure that there is some mechanism, some way of counting that that money actually goes to help those children. Because what we've heard in a lot of school districts is you're going to have some school districts that have large amounts of those youngsters in every school. But you also have school districts where some schools have higher concentrations of those youngsters. And do we have a funding mechanism that doesn't provide some way of letting us know and assuring that those schools that have those children with higher needs get those resources. So those are things that we think are base questions that we have to discuss as this goes through the process. The other thing that we've looked at, and it has to do with how decisions are made, accountability, parent involvement. Who gets a say in how this money is spent? Does the money just go to the district, and the district does what they've done in the past, and they may have a meeting, but they haven't, for example, gone and collected the information at various school sites to see what those needs are and what those parents want? We think that there needs to be a meaningful way of gaining that input and a meaningful way for parents to know how that money was spent. If you're going to have a plan, you should be able to tell your school community how much money went to certain services at your school site, how much money went to support school district-wide services. You have to have some sort of clear accounting so that one school district doesn't use one set of measurements and another school district uses another set of measurements, because you want to know this is a big deal, and you want to know how successful it was in some uniform way so that you can understand how that money was spent and whether it was spent successfully and whether the outcomes that we're looking for were measured appropriately. This whole discussion about, is success measured by one test? I think if I asked anyone in this room, they'd say, "You kidding me? You don't measure children that way." First of all, the test may not measure what the instruction was. These kids might have learned a lot of stuff, but you didn't test it. So we don't know whether or not they learned it or not because the assessment that you used didn't test it. And then there are lots of things that are not testable or reportable in a bubble test. And so we have to have an accountability system that really does, in some meaningful way, reflect how well our children are learning. So that's sort of an overview of some of our reactions and comments about the local control funding. And then I just want to, because we did take some positions on some bills, and highlight them for you, because some of them actually do have to do with money. One of them was SCA 3, which was Leno, which was the parcel tax. And we have had a consistent position of supporting the 55% vote on parcel tax. So we have taken a support position on that. The other bill that we just took a position on was, and this happens to be sort of a local issue, and that was these parcel taxes that were passed in Alameda, I believe, where they had different rates depending on how large the pieces of parcels were, and they wanted to clarify whether or not that was permissible, and we took a support for that clarification. The third issue is AB 188 Amiano, and that has to do with closing some loopholes on the transfer of real estate and whether you can transfer real estate through a corporate entity or some other legal entity by selling ownership in that legal entity or transferring ownership in that legal entity. So the idea is that if you transfer 100% of ownership in a single transaction and it changes who owns the entity, but the piece of land stays the same, you want to pick that up as a transaction. And so we supported that as a concept. Two other sort of small things, because you probably know that one of the things we've worked very hard on is having a complete quality education for all children, and the whole idea of supporting innovation,